My lords, as everyone knows, who has the biggest number is not the be-all and end-all in our galaxy. It is in fact who can tell the best story that determines true greatness. Today I shall discuss titans of sci-fi, specifically discuss empires from the Star Trek franchise, Warhammer 40,000 and Halo, and I shall attempt to create builds for all of them, in the hope to assist you in telling their wonderful stories. I've organised these by franchise, and we'll start with the United Federation of Planets from Star Trek. The United Federation of Planets is a peaceful, post-scarcity, interstellar republic that's built on diplomacy, exploration, and cooperation. This one was fairly straightforward, as we already have the United Nations of Earth, which is extremely similar in theme. I did make a couple of adjustments. For example, changing the origin from prosperous unification to common ground, so you start inside of a federation. This certainly feels more on theme, although, like with many of the empires I'll discuss today, it does sort of depend when in their timeline you wish to play as them. Civics and ethics, I think, remain the same as the UNE, as does the government type, a representative democracy. Humans are of course unchanged, but I don't think it would be unreasonable to slightly adjust these if you felt the need to do so, but everything else is more or less the same as it would be for the UNE. In terms of style of play, I think be nice to people, hold true to your egalitarian ideals, and attempt to bring the empires across the galaxy into your federation over time. Defend the weak, stand up for what is right, and the prime directive must be followed. Do not interfere with pre-FTL alien species, simply observe and learn. A species who has no such ideal, the Klingon Empire, comes next. The Klingons are a proud, warrior-centric society driven by strict codes of honor, combat, and conquest. Klingons operate as a feudal absolute monarchy with a decentralized oligarchic structure. They feature a ceremonial religious emperor as head of state, while the actual political and executive power resides with the Chancellor and Klingon High Council, which represents the powerful noble families from across their society. While fundamentally a warrior race that famously killed their own gods, Klingons still hold a deep spiritual reverence for the afterlife and the concept of honor. For these reasons, I've chosen an oligarchic government type. Klingons are of course fanatic militarists, but then we have the choice of spiritualistic or xenophobic. I went with spiritualistic as they are a spiritual people, though perhaps if I could have hearth and ethic, xenophobe may be a good choice. Although equally, I don't necessarily think they're xenophobic per se, I just think they really enjoy a good fight. And I certainly think they can respect the alien if said alien demonstrates they're worthy of respect. Aristocratic elite is a good choice to represent the great houses, though feudal society could also be a good choice here, perhaps as a third civic, and warrior culture fits for fairly obvious reasons. For a portrait, I've gone with the Ork. There isn't really a perfect match for Klingon, but this one seemed to work for me, and ironically they are quite similar to the Ork Empire that we'll discuss later on. Their home planet is called Kronos, and Tundra seemed to be the most fitting description for it. For traits I went with resilient, enduring, strong, and quarrelsome. All seem fairly easy to justify for the Klingons. For an origin, I initially went with prosperous unification. Nothing else really seemed to fit. However, you could, if you wanted to roleplay the unification of the Klingons by Kahless the Unforgettable, then Under One Rule would be a really good pick. This would mean you would need to switch to a dictatorial government type, but it seems like an entirely reasonable choice if that's the route you wish to go down. Moving on to the Vulcans. A highly logical, scientifically focused civilization driven by strict moral codes of rationality, peace, and emotional suppression. As a meritocratic technocracy with a centralized oligarchic structure. It features esteemed philosophers and elders as societal guides, while the actual political and executive power resides with High Command and the Science Directorate. This represents their greatest logical minds. While fundamentally a passionate race that famously nearly destroyed themselves in atomic fire long ago, Vulcans hold a deep philosophical reverence for peace and the concept of logic. To build them myself, I've gone with an oligarchic government type and the ethics of fanatic materialist and pacifist. I went with pacifist as they are certainly a peaceful people, though perhaps egalitarian could also fit, and perhaps xenophile could also fit. But they are somewhat aloof, so maybe not. Regarding civics, technocracy feels like a really good choice to represent the science directorate, as is meritocracy. The pointy-eared humanoid portrait seems more or less a perfect match for our pointy-eared friends. Their home planet is Vulcan, and desert seems to be the most fitting description for it. For traits, I went with intelligent, enduring, and strong. It is remarkable that many species in the Star Trek universe are much stronger than humans. It is well established that Vulcans are slow breeders, at least that's the impression given to outsiders, so I went with that as well. Though whether that's due to disciplined population control or biology, who knows. As an origin, I went with prosperous unification, though common ground could be a really good pick here, ideally with the United Federation of Planets. It's a shame that we cannot pick common ground and design the three empires for it. But let's move on to the Vulcans' cousins, the Romulans. A deeply paranoid, espionage-centric civilization driven by strict codes of statecraft, secrecy, and racial superiority. The Romulans operate as an absolute star empire with a cutthroat oligarchic structure. It features a praetor of head of state alongside the Romulan Senate and the Tal Shiar intelligence agency, both of which represent a powerful political elite. While fundamentally a passionate offshoot race that famously rejected the logic of Vulcan a long time ago. For those reasons, I've chosen an oligarchic government type, as seems quite common in the Star Trek universe. Romulans are certainly authoritarians, and I had the choice between materialist and xenophobe. I went with a mix of all three in the end, authoritarian, xenophobe and materialist, as I think they are a fairly isolationist people who rely on perhaps dangerous technology in the form of singularities and disruptors. Though if I could have a fanatic ethic, fanatic authoritarian may be a good choice here to represent the absolute power of the state. Police state is a good civic to represent the Tal Shiar, though maybe Shadow Council could also be a good choice here as well. Alongside cutthroat politics, these all feel quite fitting indeed. I've gone with the same portrait that I used for the Vulcans because they share ancestry, and it could become relevant when we discuss the origin. Their home planet is called Romulus, and a continental world seems to be quite fitting for it. For traits, I've gone with intelligent, natural physicist, decadent, and deviants. The origin here does give us a fair bit of leeway. I think Lost Colony could be a really fantastic choice, and represents the shared ancestry with the Vulcan people. However, the Romulans also have an established pattern of subjugating so-called lesser species, and using them as slaves, or frontline expendable troopers. Therefore, syncretic evolution could also be a really good pick here. This would mean you'd need to redesign a second servile species to represent the Romeans, the primary servile species of the Romulans, but I think that's an entirely reasonable choice if that's the route you wish to go down. Of course, you could go with Lost Colony and simply play as a slaver empire if you so wished. But we move on to a cornerstone of sci-fi, the Borg. The Borg are beyond iconic. They are a relentless cybernetic collective driven by strict instructions of assimilation, perfection, and to add your distinctiveness into their own. The Borg operate as a Gestalt machine intelligence with a completely unified hive mind. It features a Borg Queen as the central processing nexus, and then the collective itself, which represents the billions of interconnected drones. How much of a say they actually have versus the Queen remains unclear. While fundamentally a very terrifying race that famously assimilates entire civilizations, they are of course a Gestalt machine intelligence, and frankly the definition of driven assimilator. It is, however, slightly awkward, as in Stellaris, driven assimilator requires you to take Gestalt machine intelligence, which means you're forced down the route of a two-species empire. You have machines and cybernetically ascended enhanced organics. Now, my understanding of the Borg is that fully fledged machine units do not exist within their structure. They are all cybernetically enhanced drones. So it might not be perfect. Nevertheless, we get two species. And I would like to say I really do long for a start where I can be a driven assimilator, but as an organic cyber rather than a machine. In any case, the second civic is reasonably open, OTA updates, spyware directives, hyperspace calculations. I think all of these fit, and to be fair, you could probably justify most machine civics as a secondary here. Portrait can come with lots of options via the cybernetic page, human if you fancy it, but really it's down to whatever you like. After all, the Borg have assimilated many species indeed. Their home territory is centered around the Uni complex. A machine world seems to be the most fitting origin for this, and I have seen some float the idea of cybernetic creed. I'm not too sure about this one, but I'm sure you could justify it if you wanted to. For traits, I went with logic engines, mass-produced, durable, and bulky. All seemed reasonably easy to justify for the Borg. That covers the key players in the Star Trek franchise. Let's move on to Warhammer 40,000. And if you're enjoying this, I'd encourage you to subscribe. It really helps me out. So, Warhammer 40,000. We'll begin with the Imperium of Man. A massive, fanatical, galactic empire dedicated to the immortal God Emperor. The Imperium of Man is certainly a crowd favourite, though I think its setup will differ somewhat depending on when in its lifespan you're aiming for. For example, an Imperium in the year 30,000, led by the God Emperor, I think will look quite different to an Imperium 10,000 years later, in the 40k time period. If we're going with the 40k time period, the Imperium operates as a theocratic empire with a sprawling bureaucratic structure. It features a godlike, though comatose emperor as the head of state, while political power somewhat varies. The High Lords of Terror hold a lot, for example, but so do various factions, like the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Administratum, the Adeptus Astartes, and so on and so forth. Government type here felt somewhat awkward. On one hand, they are literally an Imperium, yet it's also sort of a dictatorship now because they're ruled by the High Lords of Terror, and the other various factions hold immense power, as I discussed. Though I guess in theory the God Emperor remains technically the head of state, so maybe an imperial government type is the one we should go with. Now ethics are an interesting one. Clearly xenophobic has its place here, likely fanatical xenophobes, but there are also elements of spiritualism and they're obviously militaristic. I think a balance of all three is a good way to go here. Regarding civics, imperial cult is a great choice here, though Byzantine bureaucracy could also be a good choice, given the power of the Administratum. I could also see a world where fanatic purifier is on the table, but the Imperium has been known to tolerate aliens when it suits. The Eldar assist in the defense of Ica 4, for example. For traits, I went with traditional, conformist, resilient, and wasteful. All seemed fairly easy to justify for humanity when playing the role of the Imperium of Man. With origin, I initially went with remnants, of course naming the world Terra. Nothing else really seemed to fit. However, you could, if you wanted to, roleplay the unification of mankind during the Great Crusade under the Emperor, in which case Under One Rule would be a really good pick here. If you do this, I'd suggest you switch to a fanatic materialist and a militaristic government type. This would better represent the imperial truth, but it also seems like a reasonable choice if that's what you want to do. I'd also suggest you add in Philosopher King as well, which would certainly differ in flavour to the 40k version. Moving on to one of my personal favourites, the Tyranids. A ravenous, biological-centric civilization driven by strict codes of consumption, adaptation, and the hive mind. The Tyranids operate as a Gestalt biological consciousness. They feature a central directing intelligence, which via its synapse creatures, hive tyrants, warriors, and so on and so forth, project commands onto the lesser creatures. I think the Tyranids are fairly straightforward to set up. You're a Gestalt consciousness, a hive mind, and a devouring swarm. There are a lot of options that you could justify as a second civic. Aesthetic, for example, even if generic, it still fits. Divided attention could reflect how the hive's psionic intelligence works, as could subspace EFAPs, and maybe even the strength of legions. They could all reflect the fact that the hive is clearly built for war above all else, and organic reprocessing could also be a fantastic pick here. We also have some further flexibility, because nomadic life could be picked. Sadly, we don't have biological arc ships. You'll have to do some headcanoning there. Maybe a mod could fix that for you. Traits, I think, are very flexible, though adaptable feels right, and the reason I suggest they're flexible is due to the origin. We've got two really solid choices: Progenitor Hive and Evolutionary Predators. Progenitor Hive works so well for an empire so completely reliant on specialized synapse leaders to direct the lesser organisms. However, Evolutionary Predator is perfect to roleplay for the pure consume and adapt nature of the Tyranid swarms. If we could combine those two origins and have biological arc ships, the galaxy would be in for a good time. Furthermore, if you wanted to try something extra spicy, such as a gene stealer cult, Necrophage could be really niche, but a really fun way to play the Tyranids. If you were to combine this with the Body Snatcher Civic and perhaps autonomous drones, you can really capture the playstyle of a gene stealer cult. To go one step further, create a child empire with Lost Colony. You're the sleeper cell that will awaken and bring about the end of the galaxy. Moving on now to the Eldar. An extremely proud, spiritualistic, xenophobic civilization that's driven by strict codes of discipline, prophecy, and survival. I think is worth raising of all the 40k races, the Eldar are perhaps the most complex, and thus can be set up in many different ways. Given the 5 craft worlds, all operate fairly differently from one another, and there is an awful lot of flexibility involved. Nevertheless, Uthway was always my favourite, so let's go with that one. The Eldar of Uthway operate as a psychic oligarchy with a highly precognitive, rigid structure. They feature a High Farseer as head of state, and a Seer Council sits directly under them. You then have the Aspect Warriors that sit under those, alongside the militia factions. For these reasons, like with many others, we're going with an oligarchic government type, and Fanatic Spiritualist alongside Xenophobic I think ties together quite nicely. They are clearly an arrogant and isolationist people, though if I could have a third ethic, militaristic may be a good choice here, given how fundamental the militia and Aspect Warriors are within their culture. Perhaps a mix of 3 would be better, and of course other craft worlds may shift those around slightly, depending on where they sit. Pompous Purist seems like a really good choice to represent their dismissive attitude towards the so-called lesser races. Memorialist seems fitting as well, though I could see a world where Chosen is chosen. But I think it most fitting for the Eldar to go down their own path in a post-birth of Slaanesh world. Pacting with the Shroud God doesn't really feel very fitting for me. There you go. Of course, what you could do is roleplay the birth of Slaanesh, and maybe go with the Instrument of Desire, but that is of course up to you. Nomadic gameplay I think is going to be a must for the Eldar, but I'm not really sure I see a world in which they start doing contracts for other empires, making it a bit awkward. I also feel that Craftworld ships would be much more powerful than the Ark ships we have access to, but it is what it is. So Voidfarers is probably the best pick here. However, if you wanted to operate as a planet-bound empire, Remnants could be a really fantastic choice. You could roleplay the Eldar, returning to planets and attempting to get a grip on the galaxy once again. Finally, species traits: intelligent, venerable, traditional and slow breeders. They all seem like fairly easy picks. But what about their cousins, the Dark Eldar? The Dark Eldar are forsaken and corrupt. They are sadistic and malicious counterparts. Like their cousins of the Craft Worlds, the Dark Eldar are an ancient and highly advanced alien race of humanoids. The Dark Eldar operate as a cutthroat oligarchy with a treacherous cabal structure. The Archons of the Dark Eldar cabals are the true lords of their people. They sit at the apex of the hierarchy that controls the Dark City and the labyrinth realm of the Dark Eldar's portion of the Webway. Oligarch is an obvious government choice here, however I think dictatorial or even imperial would be a better pick, as despite the individual Archons holding power over their sects, they have a so-called supreme warlord, though assassination and feats of strength generally determine who leads rather than hereditary titles. I do think that all 3 could be chosen depending on how you wish to experience the Dark Eldar, and I guess at what level you wanted to control them. This of course brings us on to ethics. Authoritarian feels to be the key choice here, but clearly they're also militaristic and xenophobic, and I wonder if there's an element of spiritualism to them as well. I think the best choice given the available options is a mix of authoritarian, militaristic and xenophobic. Clearly there are cruel people who view other races as prey. For Civics, Barbaric Despoilers feels like a good choice to represent their constant raiding for captives. Cutthroat Politics could also be a really good choice here, and maybe as a third civic, slaver guilds would fit quite nicely indeed. For traits, I went with intelligent, enduring, decadent, and deviant. As an origin, I initially went with void dwellers, as nothing really fit for a society living mostly within the sprawling, disconnected space of the webway. However, remnants could also be a really solid choice indeed. Bringing us on to the Orks, a brutal combat-centric civilization driven by strict codes of fighting, looting, and the Warg. The Orks operate as a warlord dictatorship within a chaotic tribal structure. It features a massive war boss as head of state, while internal factions hold some power, such as the Knobs and the Odd Boys. These represent powerful muscle and mechanic factions within the Ork structure. While fundamentally they're a fungal race that famously lives for a good fight, the Orks hold a deep, if somewhat violent, reverence for Gork and Mork. For the Orks, I've gone with a dictatorial government type. This seems best placed for strongest leader, ends up in charge. Ethics feel fairly straightforward, fanatic militarists, but the remaining ethic did give me pause. Despite their obvious aggression and the fact they're happy to enslave species, I don't think I'd describe the Orks as inherently xenophobic. I think they go to war for love of the game, rather than any deeper anti-alien reasons, and I actually think spiritualism could be a really good choice here, as it does somewhat capture the power of the Warg. Although I'm certainly open to thoughts on this one, I could see a world in where we picked materialism, for example, as they clearly have a fondness for stuff and invention. Barbaric Despoilers feels like a good choice to represent their constant raiding and looting. Scavengers also seems really fitting as well, given how they design their vehicles and ships, and Warrior Culture is also a really good choice. We are blessed by the Shroud with a very fitting Ork portrait, happy days, and for traits I went with very strong, rapid breeders, resilient, and of course, quarrelsome. This all felt rather straightforward. For origin we have a few choices. I can see a world in which post-apocalyptic is a great choice, as could be Remnants, Lost Colony, or even just a simple prosperous unification. Given the origin of the Ork menace and how they are rather difficult to dislodge, I think all of these options could be solid choices depending how you wish to play it out. Moving on to the Tau, a dynamic, technology-centric civilization driven by strict codes of unity, progress, and the greater good. The Tau operate as a caste-based oligarchy with a highly centralized, rigid structure. It features a supreme ethereal as a head of state, alongside the ethereal council and the elemental caste, which represents the powerful diplomatic, scientific, and militaristic factions. While fundamentally they're a young race that famously advanced from the Stone Age to the stars in record time, the Tau do hold a deep philosophical reverence for the Tau Va, the concept of collective harmony. The Tau claim to be a peaceful species where possible, asking if others will join their cause voluntarily instead of fighting against them. However, if their peaceful overtures are refused, they may very well decide to conquer a planet and add it into their growing stellar empire for the greater good. Searing the flesh from the bones of anyone who stands against them, well, that's part of the course. Different to many of the empires we've discussed in this report, the Tau Empire contains within multiple species. Now this is difficult to replicate for a starting Stellaris empire, but we will address it with origin. Regarding government type, as is so common with these, I think oligarchic is the best choice. For ethics I've gone with fanatic materialist. The second ethic is a bit more difficult to place. I think authoritarian could fit under the guise of the greater good. I certainly don't think they're pacifistic, but nor do I think they're inherently militaristic. The caste system suggests that egalitarian is not a good choice, leaving xenophobe and xenophile. Given how willing they are to integrate other species into their empire, and under the doctrine of greater good, xenophile feels like the best choice for a secondary ethic. If we could choose half an ethic, maybe militaristic would also be a good choice here, given their reliance on the fire caste and their battlesuit technology. Regarding civics, I think diplomatic core is a great choice here to represent the water caste. Idealistic foundation could also be a good choice, as could technocracy, though I can see an argument for aristocratic elite to represent the ethereal leaders. For traits I went with intelligent, conformist, traditional, and weak. The home planet is simply called Tau, and an arid or a desert world seems to be the most fitting description of it. As an origin, I initially went with prosperous unification. This is perfect for a young species recently united. However, if you wanted to roleplay the heavy integration of the Kroot and the Vespid into their empire, syncretic evolution could be a really good pick here. This would mean you need to design a second servile species to represent the alien auxiliaries, but it feels like a very reasonable choice if that's the route you want to go down. Onto the Forces of Chaos, the final 40k empire for me to discuss, and quite a difficult one to pin down given the various sects and offshoots. Clearly the Forces of Chaos could justify many picks here, but I think if we focus on the original traitors, the Black Legion, this should make our task slightly easier. Of course, I'm aware other traitors will operate in a vastly different manner. The Black Legion, as it is now known, was formed after the death of Horus, the War Master, now under the leadership of Abaddon the Despoiler, who claimed Horus's mantle as the War Master of Chaos. The leaders of the Black Legion warbands will, in various degrees, answer to Abaddon, but it's worth pointing out that the Legion is largely broken up after the events on their homeworld, and is largely fleet-based, which is perfect for nomadic gameplay. The Legion is certainly a dictatorship, and many choices could be taken regarding ethics. Militaristic is a clear and obvious choice, so is authoritarian, and so is spiritualistic. I think a balance of the three is a good shout. They're also clearly xenophobic, though whether that factors in more than the other three, I don't think so. For civics, entropy drinkers seems like a great fit. The hierarchy of the Legion most certainly feeding on the energy of lesser beings, and I think this somewhat reflects demonic ascension, and so on and so forth. Warrior culture could be a really good choice here, so would barbaric despoilers, and the Chosen could also be a really fitting choice as well, particularly if you wish to disown your Shroud Pact identity and go your own way later into the game. For traits, I went with strong, resilient, deviant, and unruly. Origins are fairly open. For the Legion specifically, a nomadic lifestyle would be appropriate, so Voidfarers. But I could also see a world where Knights of the Toxic Gods could work, or even Teachers of the Shroud. It all sort of depends on when in the timeline you wish to play as the Legion. But moving on, I wanted to cover more than Star Trek and 40k here, so let's round this off looking at the Halo universe with the Covenant. The Covenant are a theocratic, hegemony-centric civilization driven by strict codes of faith, caste hierarchy, and the ultimate goal to complete the Great Journey. The Covenant, highly dogmatic, features the High Council, where the prophets sit, as their head of state, although they also have the various castes of aliens underneath them, and power resides with the Fleet Masters as well, for example. The issue with setting up the Covenant in Stellaris pertains to the ability to only select 2 species on game start, and that requires specific origins. Broken Shackles aside, as I don't think it's a good fit here, it means that we really can only go with syncretic evolution. In any case, for government type I've gone with oligarchic to represent the High Council more than anything else. Ethics felt fairly easy, fanatic spiritualist, and militarist. I went with militarist as they are a crusading people who will eagerly conquer new worlds in the name of their so-called gods. Though if I could have a third ethic as authoritarian, I don't think that would be the worst choice given the clear, rigid structure of their caste system. Exalted Priesthood felt like a really good choice to represent the absolute rule of the prophets alongside Crusader Spirit. If we assume the race that we are playing as is the prophets, then traditional conformist, decadent, and weak all seem very reasonable picks. As an origin, Hegemon would feel like a reasonable choice, but it depends on how far into the timeline you want to progress. I could also see a world where syncretic evolution is chosen, the lesser species being the elites, but I could also see a world where you started as a nomad to represent high charity, or even a void dweller. I think there's loads of open choices here depending on exactly what you want to do. My lords, if you've enjoyed this and want me to cover more empires in a similar manner, please comment what franchises you'd want me to do.